The Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. As a sergeant in the Imperial Guard, Bourgogne describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers, including brutal battles, extreme weather, and the struggle for survival during the retreat from Moscow. His candid, first-hand perspective brings to life the physical and emotional challenges of the campaign, making his memoirs a vivid and human account of one of history's most disastrous military endeavors. These are his words. Let's begin. It was in the month of March 1812, while we were engaged against the English army commanded by Wellington at Almeida in Portugal, that we received orders to march for Russia. We crossed Spain, each day being marked by an engagement, sometimes by two, and in this way reached Bayonne, the first town over the frontier in France. On leaving this place, we traveled by the stage as far as Paris, where we expected to stay and rest. But after a halt of 48 hours, the Emperor reviewed us and, deciding that we were not in need of rest, marched us all along the boulevards. Then we turned to the left in the Rue Saint-Martin, crossed La Villette, and found several hundred coaches and other vehicles waiting for us. We halted, but were ordered to mount 4 into every carriage and crack. We were off to Meaux, from there onwards to the Rhine in wagons traveling day and night. We stayed at Mayence and then crossed the Rhine, afterwards passing on foot through the Grand Duchy of Frankfurt, Franconia, Saxony, Prussia, and Poland. We crossed the Vistula at Marienwerder, entered Pomerania, and on the morning of June 25th, a beautiful day, not, as Monsieur de Ségur said, in bad weather, we passed over the Niemen by our pontoons and entered Lithuania, the first province in Russia. On the next day we left our first position and marched until the 29th without anything noteworthy happening. But during the night of the 29th and 30th we heard a rumbling noise. It was thunder accompanied by a furious wind. Masses of clouds gathered over our heads and broke. The thunder and the wind lasted for more than 2 hours, and in a few minutes our fires were put out, our shelter torn away, our piled arms thrown down. We were lost, and did not know which way to turn. I ran to take shelter in the direction of the village where the general was lodged, but I had only the lightning to guide me. Suddenly, in one of the flashes, I thought I saw a road. It was unfortunately a canal, swollen by the rain to the level of the ground. Expecting to find solid earth under my feet, I plunged in and sank. On rising to the surface, I swam to the other bank and at last reached the village. I walked into the first house I saw and entered a room filled by about 20 men, officers and servants, all asleep. I took possession of a bench placed near a large warm stove, and, undressing, wrung the water out of my shirt and other clothes, huddling myself up on the bench till they were dry. When daylight came, I dressed as well as I could, and left the house to look for my weapons and knapsack, which I found scattered in the mud. On the 30th, a beautiful sun dried everything, and the same day we reached Wilna, the capital of Lithuania, where the emperor had arrived the day before, with some of the guard. While we were there, I received a letter from my mother, enclosing another addressed to Monsieur Constant, the emperor's chief valet, who came from Pérouvels in Belgium. This letter was from his mother, an acquaintance of my mother's. I went to the emperor's lodging to deliver the letter, but only saw Rustan, the emperor's Mameluke, who told me that Monsieur Constant had gone out with his majesty. He invited me to wait till he returned, but as I was on duty, I could not do so. I gave him the letter and decided to come back and see Monsieur Constant another time. But the next day, July 16th, we left the town at 10 o'clock in the evening going towards Borisov, and on the 27th we reached Vitebsk, where we encountered Russians. We took up our position on a height above the town. The enemy occupied hills to the right and left. The cavalry, commanded by Murat, had already made several charges. Just as we arrived, we saw 200 voltigeurs of the 9th Regiment, who had ventured too far, met by a portion of the Russian cavalry, which had just been repulsed. Unless help arrived speedily to our men, they were lost, as the river and some deep gullies made access to them very difficult. But they were commanded by gallant officers who swore, as did also the men, to kill themselves rather than not come honorably out of it. Fighting as they went, they reached a piece of favorable ground. They formed a square, and having been under fire before, their nerves were not shaken by the number of the enemy. They were quite surrounded, however, by a regiment of lancers and other horse trying in vain to cut through them, and soon they had a rampart of killed and wounded all round them, both of men and horses. This formed another obstacle for the Russians who, terrified, fled in disorder, amid cries of joy from the whole army. Our men came back again quietly, as conquerors, every now and then stopping to face the enemy. The emperor at once sent for the most distinguished and decorated them with the Order of the Legion of Honor. From a height opposite to ours, the Russians had, like us, seen the engagement and flight of their cavalry. After this brush, we made our bivouacs, and directly afterwards, I had a visit from 12 young men from my own country, Condé. 10 of them were drummers, one a drum major, and the 12th was a corporal of voltigeurs. They all wore sidearms. I told them how much pleasure it gave me to see them, and said I was sorry I had nothing to offer them. The drum major said, "My countrymen, we did not come for that, but to beg you to come with us and share what we have, wine, gin, and other things very good for you. We took them yesterday evening from the Russian general. There was a little cart holding his kitchen and everything belonging to it. We have put it all into the canteen cart, with Florencia, our cantinière. She is a pretty Spaniard. She might be taken for my wife. I protect her. Honorably, I can tell you." As he said this, he struck the hilt of his long rapier. "She is a good woman. Ask the others. No one dares say anything else. She had a fancy for a sergeant, who was to have married her, but he was murdered by a Spaniard from Bilbao. And until she has chosen someone else, she must be taken care of. Well, then, my countryman, it is settled. You will come with us. If there is enough for 3, there is enough for 4. Come, right about, march." And we set off towards their army corps, which formed the advance guard. Well, we got to the camp of the natives of Condé. There were 4 guests, 2 dragoons, Melet, who was from Condé, Flamand from Pérouels, and Grangier, a non-commissioned officer in the same regiment as myself. We sat down near the cantinière's cart. She really was a very pretty Spaniard, and she was overjoyed to see us, as we had just come from her own country, and could speak her language pretty well, the dragoon Flamand best of all, so we spent the night in drinking the Russian general's wine and talking of our country. Day was just breaking when a sound of artillery put a stop to our talking. We went back to our own quarters, hoping to meet again. The poor fellows little thought that in a few days 11 of them would not be alive. This was the 28th. We expected to fight, but the Russian army retreated, and the same day we got to Vitebsk, where we stayed a fortnight. Our regiment occupied one of the faubourgs of the town. I was quartered with a Jew who had a pretty wife and 2 charming daughters with lovely oval faces. In this house I found a little vat for making beer, some barley, and a hand mill for grinding, but no hops. I gave the Jew 12 francs to get some, and for fear he might not return, we kept Rachel, his wife, and his 2 daughters as hostages. However, 24 hours after his departure, Jacob the Jew returned with the hopes. In our company was a brewer, a Fleming, who made us 5 barrels of excellent beer. On August 13, when we left the town, we still had 2 barrels of beer left. We put them under the care of Mother Dubois, our cantinière. The happy idea then occurred to her of staying behind and of selling the beer for her own profit to the men who were following us, while we, in the sweltering heat, were nearly dead of thirst. Early on the morning of the 16th, we arrived before Smolensk. The enemy had just retired there, and we took up our position on the Champ Sacré, so called by the natives of the place. This town is surrounded by very strong walls and old towers half made of wood. The Borysthenes, the Dnieper, runs on one side of the town. The siege was begun at once and a breach made, and on the morning of the 17th, when we were preparing to make an assault, to our surprise we found the town evacuated. The Russians were retreating, but they had demolished the bridge, and from a height which commanded the town they rained down bombs and shot on us. During that day of the siege, I, with one of my friends, was stationed at the outpost whence batteries were playing on the town. Marshal Davoust commanded this position. Recognizing us as belonging to the Guard, he came to us and asked where the Imperial Guard was. Directly afterwards, he was told that the Russians had left the town and were advancing in our direction. He immediately ordered a battalion of light infantry to take the advanced position, saying to the officer in command, "If the enemy advances, you will drive them back." I remember an old officer of this battalion, as he went forward, singing Roland's song, "How many are they? How many are they?" This is the cry of the soldier without glory. 5 minutes afterwards they advanced with the bayonet on the Russian column and forced it to re-enter the town. As we returned to our own camp, we were very nearly killed by a shell. Another fell on a barn inhabited by Marshal Mortier and set it on fire. I recognized among the men who brought water to extinguish the fire a young soldier from my own country. He was in a regiment of the Young Guard. While we stayed outside the town, I visited the cathedral, where a large number of the inhabitants had taken refuge, their houses having been destroyed. On the 21st we left, and the same day we crossed the Valutina plain, where 2 days before a terrible encounter had taken place, and the brave General Gudin had been killed. We continued to advance, and by forced marches arrived at a town called Dorogobui. We left on the 24th, following up the Russians as far as Vyazma, which was already in flames, and found there some brandy and a little food. We went on to Gujal, which we reached on September 1st. There we stayed until the 4th, when we went forward again, and on the 5th met the Russian army in position. The 61st captured their first redoubt. We got ready on the 6th for the great battle on the next day. Some cleaned muskets and other weapons. Others made bandages for the wounded. Some made their wheels. And others, again, sang or slept, in perfect indifference. The whole of the Imperial Guard received orders to appear in full uniform. At 5 o'clock on the morning of the next day, we were under arms. The Emperor passed near us while he reviewed the whole line. He had been mounted for more than half an hour. The battle began at 7 o'clock. I cannot describe it in detail, but the whole army was overjoyed to hear the roar of the artillery, feeling certain that this time the Russians had not decamped, and that we should come face to face with them. The evening before, and for part of the night, a fine cold rain had fallen. But on this great day the weather was magnificent. This, like all our great battles, was won by the artillery, which fired 120,000 rounds. The Russians lost at least 50,000 men, either killed or wounded. Our loss was 17,000 men, 43 generals disabled, 8 of whom, to my knowledge, were killed on the spot. These were Montbrun, Huard, Caulaincourt, the brother of the Emperor's equerry, Compère Maison, Plauzon, Lepelle, and Annebert. This last was colonel of a regiment of foot chasseurs. Each moment a message was sent to the Emperor. Sire, such and such a general is killed or wounded, and his place had to be filled on the spot. This was how Colonel Annebert was made general. I remember it very well, for I was close to the Emperor at the time. His words were, "Colonel, I appoint you general, lead the division which is in front of the great redoubt, and take it." The general galloped off, with his adjutant major following him as his aide-de-camp. A quarter of an hour afterwards the aide-de-camp returned and announced to the Emperor that the redoubt was taken, but that the general was wounded. 8 days afterwards he died, along with several others. I heard that the Russians lost 50 generals, either killed or wounded. While the fighting lasted, we were placed in reserve, behind General Miaut's division. Balls fell all amongst our ranks and round the Emperor. The battle ended with the day, and we remained on the field all night, and all the next day, the 8th. I spent that day in walking over the field, a sad and terrible spectacle. Granger was with me, and we went as far as the ravine, the position so hotly disputed during the battle. Murat had ordered his tents to be pitched there. Just as we arrived, we saw him superintend the amputation by his own surgeon of the legs of 2 gunners of the Imperial Russian Guard. When the operation was over, he gave them each a glass of wine. Afterwards he walked on the edge of the ravine, examining the plain which lies on the other side, fringed by a wood. There, on the preceding day, he had made more than one Muscovite bite the dust, while he and his cavalry charged the retreating enemy. He was splendid to look at, so distinguished by his gallantry, his cool courage, and his handsome appearance, giving his orders to those under his command and raining blows on his enemies. He was easily picked out by his cap, his white aigrette, and his floating cloak. On the morning of the 9th, we left the battlefield, and during the day reached Mozhaïsk. The Russian rear guard was on a height the opposite side of the town from that occupied by us. A company of voltigeurs and grenadiers, with more than 100 men of the 33rd, making part of the advance guard, ascended the hill without troubling themselves about the number of the enemy waiting for them. A part of the army, still in the town, watched them astonished, as several squadrons of cuirassiers and Cossacks advanced and surrounded the voltigeurs and grenadiers. But, as if they had foreseen all that, they quietly reunited, formed into platoons, then in a square, and fired from all four sides on the Russians surrounding them. We gave them up for lost, knowing the distance separating us from them and no help being possible. A Russian superior officer went up to them, telling them to surrender. The officer in command of the French answered him by killing him. Upon this the cavalry, terrified, ran away and left our men masters of the field. On the 10th we followed the enemy until the evening, and when we stopped I was put in command of a guard near a chateau where the emperor lodged. I had just placed my men on a road leading to the chateau when a Polish servant, whose master was on the emperor's staff, passed near us, leading a horse laden with baggage. The horse was worn out, sank down, and refused to get up again. The servant took the baggage and went off. He had hardly left us when the men, who were hungry, killed the horse, so that all night we were busy eating it and cooking for the next day. Soon afterwards the emperor passed on foot, accompanied by Murat and a member of the Conseil d'État, on their way to the high road. I made my sentries present arms. The emperor stopped in front of us and near the horse, which filled up the road. He asked me if we were eating it. I replied, yes. He smiled and said, patience. In 4 days we shall be at Moscow, where you will have rest and proper food, however good that horse may be. His prediction was fulfilled. For 4 days afterwards we arrived at that city. The next day, the 11th, and following days we marched in beautiful weather. On the 13th we slept at a place near a beautiful abbey and several other fine buildings. We could see that we were approaching a great capital. On the 14th we set out very early. We passed near a ravine where the Russians had begun to make redoubts for defense, and directly afterwards we entered a great forest of pines and birches, where we found a beautiful road. Now we were quite near Moscow. On that day I was with an advance guard of 15 men. After marching for an hour, the Imperial column halted, and just then I saw a linesman with his left arm in a sling. He was leaning on his musket, and seemed to be waiting for someone. I recognized him at once as one of the Condé men who had been to see me at Vitebsk. He was there hoping to meet me. I went up to him and asked him after his friends. They are well, he answered, striking the ground with the butt end of his musket. They all died on the field of honor, as they say, and were buried in the great redoubt. They were killed by round shot. Ah, Sergeant, he went on, never shall I forget that battle. What slaughter! And you, I said, what is the matter with you? Ah, bah, nothing. A ball between the elbow and shoulder. Sit down for a minute, and let us talk of our poor comrades and the young Spaniard, our cantinier. This is what he told me. We had been fighting since 7 in the morning, when General Campan's, who commanded us, was wounded. The officer who took his place was wounded also, and then the third. A fourth came, this one from the guard. Directly he took command, he ordered the drums to sound the charge. That was how our regiment, the 61st, was destroyed by grape shot. That was how our friends were killed, the redoubt taken, and the general wounded. It was General Anaber. During the action, I got a ball in the arm, without knowing it at the time. Soon afterwards, my wound began to pain me, and I went to the ambulance to have the ball extracted. I had not gone many steps before I met the young Spaniard, our cantinier. She was in tears. Some men had told her that nearly all the drummers of the regiment were killed or wounded. She said she wanted to see them, to help them if she could. So in spite of the pain I suffered from my wound, I determined to accompany her. We walked in the midst of wounded men. Some moved painfully and with difficulty, and others were carried on litters. When we got near the great redoubt and that field of carnage, she uttered heart-rending cries. But when she caught sight of all the broken drums of the regiment strewing the ground, she became like a mad woman. "Here, my friend, here!" she cried. "They are here!" And so they were, lying with broken limbs, their bodies torn by shot. Mad with grief, she went from one to the other, speaking softly to them, but none of them heard. Some, however, still gave signs of life, one of them being the drum major, whom she called her father. She stopped by him, and, falling on her knees, she raised his head and poured a few drops of brandy between his lips. Just at that moment the Russians made an effort to retake the redoubt, and the firing and cannonade began again. Suddenly the Spaniard cried with pain. She had been struck by a ball in her left hand, which crushed her thumb and entered the shoulder of the dying man she held. She fell unconscious. Seeing her danger, I tried to raise her and take her to the baggage and ambulance wagons. But with only one arm I had not strength enough. Happily, a cuirassier passed on foot close to us. He did not need asking. He only said, "Quick, we must hurry. This is not a pleasant place." In fact, the bullets were whistling round us. Without more ado, he lifted the young Spaniard and carried her like a child. She still remained unconscious. After walking for 10 minutes, we got to a little wood where there was an ambulance of the Guard artillery. Here Florencia came to her senses. Monsieur Larrey, the Emperor's surgeon, amputated her thumb and extracted the ball from my arm very cleverly, and now I feel all right again. This is what I heard from Dumont, the man from Condé, corporal of the voltigeurs of the 61st. I made him promise to come to see me at Moscow if we stayed there, but I never heard of him again. Thus perished 12 young men from Condé in the famous Battle of Moskowa, September 7th, 1812. That concludes the first part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment